Her areas of studies include human rights, interethnic relations, international migration, political elites, racism, and violence. She is the author of the book Violencias y Migraciones Centroamericanas en México, published in 2017, and winner of the Latin American Studies Association Book Prize. And she also is co-editor of Experiencias de Migrantes Mexicanos de Retorno de Estados Unidos, published just last year. Dr. Paris-Pombo has also been featured in several publications. Her work has been featured in several publications, including the Journal of Borderland Studies, Latin American Perspectives, Migraciones Internacionales, among others. So please help me welcome Dr. Paris-Pombo to her remarks.
Thank you so much, Cecilia, for inviting me, and for putting this wonderful conference, which I know it's very difficult and a lot of work. So thank you also to Rubén Hernández León and to Leslie Abrego. So I will also begin with the 80s. It looks like all of us begin with that. First, I would like to, oh, I have this. No. Sí, pero no me sirve. Sí. Oh, okay. Okay. So first of all, I wanted to understand that if you watched the movie, the documentary yesterday, which was really very good, you saw these ideas much better than what I will explain. That there is a continuity, a geographical and historical continuity in the forms of violence in Central America, Mexico, and in the US. That continuity should also be explained from a gender perspective. This is one of the ideas I want to stress here. The other is that sexual violence can be a consequence of militarization. This was one question one of the students was asking me a while ago. So it's it is a consequence in the US side of the border, but also in Mexico and in Central America. And that we must understand violence as multiple layers. And you will see that patriarchalism and racism are the base of those different violences that are structured by the policies, by the migration policies, the security policies, and the militarization. So in the 80s, but since well before, we had the wars in Central America, in Guatemala and in El Salvador. In the case of Honduras, Honduras was an agricultural enclave until the 80s, and in the 80s it was a military enclave. It just passed to be an agricultural to a military enclave of the United States. And so we had really a militarization of the politics, the society, the culture, and all power relations were impregnated by that militarization. We had different causes, factors of migration in the 90s, principally mainly from the degradation, the climate degradation, the environmental degradation, and we had the earthquakes in El Salvador. We also heard about that yesterday and today, and Hurricane Mitch in 1998. And then we had what we know as the transition to democracy. But the outcome was not necessarily democracy. So we always, in political science, there was a bunch of works on transitions from dictatures, from military regimes to democracy. But often we didn't reach really democracy. And finally, we have, since the 1910s, another type of migration in a situation that a colleague from Guatemala, a sociologist, Edgar Gutierrez, called a low-intensity peace, because in the 80s we often talked about low-intensity wars. And what we reached was some kind of peace and some kind of alternance of the governments, but not really peace. In fact, there was even more deaths by murders in the 2010s than in the 80s. So some elements of change. We didn't return to the armed confrontation, but there was what Delberto Torres Rivas, also a Guatemalan sociologist, called the paradox, more democracy but more inequality. And an important change also, it was coming already in the 80s, but it reached another level in the 90s and 2000, was the consequences of development projects, particularly mining. You saw that also on documentaries, on the documentary yesterday. And generally, the violence against activists, and particularly on environmental activists. Many activists, environmental activists, have been murdered in Central America. Then we had a paramilitarization of the politics and the society, but it came often from paramilitary organizations who rendered their weapons, but then purchased other weapons, and they became vigilantism groups and gangs, etc. So the elements of continuity was this militarization. I think that this is very important. Even today, military have a huge power in all these countries. We are speaking mainly about Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, but today the exile is affecting also very profoundly the Nicaraguan people. The high murder rates and the devastation of the economies. It was in the 80s very closely linked to the wars, and today it's linked to this neoliberal notion of the benefit at all costs. And private armed groups are often colluded with authorities. Then I wanted to take some testimonies of Salvadoran women and Honduran women. And this is from the 80s. And this was, you cannot hear anymore this discourse today. But it's very important to understand that the exile in the 80s was very politicized. And it is not anymore. You don't hear the same discourses. So this woman says, I was a member of the Fuerzas Populares de Liberación, and my son was a political prisoner. We participated in meetings, visited political prisoners. We fought for our son's freedom and also for the freedom of our country. And then they detained a compañera, and she didn't resist the torture. She gave them my name. So they, the military, were looking for me. That's when the compañeros told me that I have to leave immediately. One thing interesting is that this woman, she couldn't read or write, but she had in the 80s, she went to all the countries in Europe. She was with the son of Roque Dalton. We heard about Roque Dalton yesterday in a tour to social organizations in Europe. And yes, so it was another type of exile. There are changes. That's what I wanted to stress. And the militarization had also very profound consequences on gender and sexual violence. And this has to do with masculinities defended in the process of militarization and to the the power the soldiers had. So this is another woman. She was also participating with an organization at the time, and she said, I had to flee to Mexico. The thing is that I had a boyfriend, and we were together in the park near San Carlos military headquarters. Suddenly, 3 men came to us with their guns. One of them took my boyfriend with him, and the other 2 caught me. So I thought they got me because they had a military haircut. I thought they were taking me to prison, but instead they raped me. My boyfriend filed a criminal complaint against the soldiers, and I had to testify, but my mother said, go away immediately, go with your brother to Mexico. So she came to Mexico. And then we have different kind of situations in the 2010s. Again, we have violence against women, again militarization, and another phenomenon which seems to replace paramilitary, which is Mara, gangs, etc. And this woman had to flee because the Mara wanted to kidnap her daughter. So there is an appropriation of the bodies, which is kind of a consequence also of militarization, and the control of certain territories by the gangs. And the daughter was 13, and finally the Mara kidnapped her brother, who was at the time 16, and she flew to Mexico. She is now in Sweden, in fact, because she was relocated, and she left her boy backwards. She couldn't go with her boy. She had to renounce to her son, so she could flee with the other 3 kids. we don't hear the same politicized discourse. It's more like everything is s'effrite, goes away, disappears, and it's so what is happening when refugees arrive to Mexico? The COMARC is the Mexican Commission to help refugees, and it was founded in 1980. At the time, the refugees were recognized. There was no law to recognize refugees, and Mexico was not a signatory of the convention. So they were recognized prima facie, which means that only for the fact of being from Guatemala and arriving with their communities, they were recognized. The UNHCR arrived to Mexico in 1982. And in 1984, we had the thing is that from 1990 to 2011, when we had the law, we recognized about a mean of 118 refugees per year. So when finally we had the status of refugee, there was no more refuge in Mexico. Very few refugees recognized in 20 years. And then in 2011, we began to have 1,000 applications, the next year 3,000, etc. So we had this surge. Last year it was 70,300 applications for refugee status in Mexico. The COMAR is a very poor institution. It has around $1 million per year of a budget. And it's just to give them the recognition, to have the interview, etc. But it cannot work anymore with that budget. And the first year of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, there was even a cut in the budget of COMAR, which means that the government was not interested in recognizing more refugees in Mexico. But the situation is that the only way to be legal, to have documents in Mexico in this moment, if you are a poor migrant coming from Central America, is the refuge. You don't have anything more. There was an emergent program of humanitarian visas in January and February, but they stopped it because there were too many applications. So it was just for a time, but most of Central American migrants cannot have any paper unless they apply for the refugee status. And Mexico has been, and that all my colleagues also already talked about that. Mexico has been doing a job to stop Central American migration. This was in 2001, and it's taken from the INM, Instituto Nacional de Migración, Migration National Institute, from the archives. It was what was called at the time Plan Sur. And it was exactly the same thing that they did in 2014, 2016. But they called at the time Programa Integral para la Frontera Sur. Everybody said Plan Sur because we were used to that. But it was another program, but the same thing. And this idea, we also heard from the Andrés Manuel López Obrador government, this idea of stopping the migrants in El Istmo, the isthmus of Tehuantepec, because the border with Guatemala is not only very long, but most of them in La Selva, the rain forest. And you cannot have officials there stopping. And there is a lot of movement through the border that is not migrants. It's just trans-border movements without any papers. It's historical. So you cannot stop migrants here. You stop them here in the isthmus of Tehuantepec. And so it's very hard to go further for undocumented migrants. What happened with migrants who were not from Central America? There was a very pragmatic policy. They received a paper called Oficio de Salida, which means exit document. And they had 20 days to be in Mexico, and after that they had to leave. And it was enough to fly from Tapachula, the southmost city of Mexico, to Tijuana, and seek asylum in San Isidro. But there was a lot of corruption with that document. So you usually had to pay $1,000 just to have the document. There were many brokers, etc. And the National Institute for Migration stopped completely that practice, which means that today we have thousands of Haitians and Cubans waiting to have their refugee status for months and months in the south of Mexico. So this has been, I worked last year with an organization called Centro de Derechos Humanos Fray Matías de Córdoba, Center for Human Rights, Fray Matías. And so it was a moment in June when the National Guard arrived to the southern border. The National Guard didn't exist. So from one day to the other, they promised to the Trump administration that they would send the National Guard to the southern border. And they had all the military, federal police, every agency with their brazaletes and GN, National Guard. But they become from a soldier to a National Guard from one day to another just to please the Trump administration. So people are blocked in southern Mexico, more and more, thousands of them. And not only from Central America, more and more we have a very diverse population. In this moment in Estación Migratoria, which is the detention center in Tapachula, more than half the population is from other parts of the world, and many are from Africa, from India, Pakistan, and many other countries. So we had a survey with El Centro de Derechos Humanos, and I just wanted to show very few results to show that this situation affects differently women and men. As you can see, most women were traveling with children. Not in the case of the men. So the difference is very big. And that means that most of the female migration to southern Mexico and often to the US is with minors. and with children. And in the case of the possibility to sustain themselves, to work and to have some kind of income, for women with children, it's almost impossible. First, they don't have where to register their kids. We also asked, did you try to register your kids in the school? And so those who tried, only 10 of 127 could register their kids. Because it's very hard to register the kids in Mexico. In Tijuana, we have improved a little that, but in southern Mexico, if you are not Mexican citizen and you have to do a lot of paperwork, then only two kind of jobs they had: domestic work or care work, and preparing food. But men had like 10 or 12 kind of jobs. For the women to find a job is you only have those options. And which was quite amazing is the number of people who were sleeping in the streets. And more we see homeless migrants also in southern Mexico. And victim of crime also was very high. 3 from every 10 women had been victims of crime. So the risks, this is another testimony from a Salvadoran refugee. And she says, in this moment, Tapachula, which is that city with the most in the southern of Mexico, you see long lines in front of many, in front of Comar, of course, in front of the social organizations like Centro de Derechos Humanos, since 5, 4 o'clock, and sometimes all the night in front of Comar, you have long lines of people waiting to have an appointment so they can apply for the refugee status. And those lines are very dangerous for women, and more for women with children, because around the lines you can see people, some of them trying to sell their goods, others trying to catch vulnerable families so they can kidnap them and ask them a ransom. And so this woman, she says, so we came to Comar and I saw a very long line of people who wanted to fill an application. My children sat near the wall and the officer said, who is the mother of these children? And he made me go to his office and said, here you don't have to tell anybody who you are and why you are here. Can you see all these people? Someone here is chasing you. So this is the sentiment, and they were kidnapped. In fact, they were kidnapped. She says that probably it was in front of the Casa del Migrante, in the shelter where they were staying. Trying to understand what is different from the 80s to today in Mexico for Central American migrants. I said at the beginning that we have this base of the pyramid, of the structure of violence, how violence is structured. And it's xenophobia or racism, call it as you want. Some of my colleagues were very clear that we are the same people. as a Central American. We don't have big differences physically talking. Generalized extortion, it was very often in the 80s. Almost all migrants who arrived to the United States had to give something in the, along the journey to the police, to the officers, to the officials. Criminalization of migration. This has been also in Mexico, not only in the US, a long history. But we had another layer, which was the sexual and gender violence and the systematic deportation also of migrants without asking even why you are here, so denying their right to asylum. Today, we have another layer. We have also detention and deportation, and very frequently the situation of gender violence. But we also have more and more the organized crime embedded into the public institutions. So as I was saying a while ago with some students, what we have today is a strong intertwined relation with from organized crime or disorganized crime, because we always think about organized crime, but sometimes they are like small gangs controlling a territory, and police sometimes working for those gangs, or sometimes even working for criminal organizations. So you probably heard about the massacre of 72 migrants in San Fernando in August 2010. Many of the perpetrators were police officers from Tamaulipas. And it was the Zetas. So the police officers were working for the criminal organizations. Do you call that corruption? I'm not sure. We have to talk about something else at this time. And what has happened is that with neoliberalism, we have legitimized a form of exploitation in which human bodies are merchandises. And so there has been some kind of commodifications. So here, Ruben worked a lot on migration industry. And my idea is that this migration industry changed radically at some point. And from selling services to the migrants, the bodies of the migrants' bodies became the merchandise. And this is another kind of commodification of the migration. And then we have wide systems of extortion and kidnapping. Amarela talked about that. And a transition, so in the 80s, and we had big criminal organizations, Cartel de Sinaloa, Cartel de Guadalajara. We already knew the cartels. But today we cannot, I don't think we can even anymore talk about cartels. It's not that. It's more than there are many small criminal organizations, sometimes in networks, controlling some of the territory with the help of officials, of Mexican officials. And so the end is that from migration industry to the commodification of migrants' bodies. And finally, I wanted to talk a little about the caravans, because it has been like a media effect. And first I wanted to say that the collective mobility in Mexico was very known already by the train. So the train, usually in the 2000s, it used to have more than 200 migrants on the roofs of the trains and in the. But that was in 2015 with the Programa Integral de la Frontera Sur, and there were very little, like 40 migrants, 20 migrants in the trains. And the Caravans is a form of resistance against all those kinds of violence against migrants. It was a resistance from the beginning, and Amarela knows that much better than I. It was from the beginning a way to show, to be visible for the world, which are the conditions in which people is traveling in Mexico. And it was, we had the caravan of mothers, and we had the caravans of Via Crucis, which was in March, April. There were activists, mothers of migrants disappeared in the journey. And what we have today is a resistance through collective mobility. People have to live, and this is the way they can live. I think that I have finished my time, don't I? Okay.
Questions, comments for Dolores? Yes, we need the mic.
Anybody have?
Sí, sí.
Thank you for being here. My question was for whether the same study that you conducted my question was if whether the information you collected from the study in Tapachula in 2019, you were able to determine the country of origin of that 50% were non-Central American?
Yes. So this is in the official data. I just will tell you one data that is amazing, I think. So in 2018, we had about 200 applications from Haitian, do I say it okay? Haitianos. Haitian migrants. And in 2019, we had about 7,000 applications. In the case of Cubans, we had in 2018 less than 100 applications. And last year, we had more than 8,000 applications. So we have thousands of people. In 2016, we received, Mexico received around 18,000 Haitian migrants. Most of them came from Brazil, not from Haiti. They had lived in Brazil. This is another, I don't have time because this is a Central American migration talk, but it's like they are like nomads of globalization. They cannot settle anywhere. They settle and then they are expelled and they try to settle at another point and they are expelled. So this is, and we have many Africans, around 4,000 to 10,000, depending on the 10,000 migrants from Africa, but from very diverse countries. Oh, Venezuela, we have also thousands. Mm-hmm.
Hola, Dolores. Muchas gracias. Soy Michael Rodríguez de la Escuela de Medicina y muy agradecido de su presentación. Voy a hacer la pregunta en inglés para que todos puedan entender. The data that you presented that contrasted men versus women, particularly so many women, such a high proportion of women with children. When I saw that, I was a little surprised that there was not a bigger difference in reporting of crimes by the women as we saw. And I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on that, because I would think the women might be sort of, as you already stated, for many reasons, more vulnerable to such crimes or different types of crimes. And so any thoughts about why the difference is not bigger?
In fact, the first surveys we had a survey on 2011 and 2012 in all the country, which was called Survey on Aggression Against Migrants in Mexico. And we found that there were more men than women reporting aggressions. And there are different explanations. One of them, we see much less women migrants in Mexico. We don't see them, which doesn't mean that they are not here. They are much more invisible than men. When there was that number of children arriving to the United States in 2014, and then again in 2016, we hadn't seen them in Mexico. From India, there are many migrants from India who travel through Mexico. Nobody knows that. They are completely invisible. They have their own networks. So it's the same situation. If you don't see them, you don't deport them, you don't research on them, you don't come to... when I show the train, all the works on migration through Mexico show the train, always. And the train is less than 20% of the movement in Mexico, and almost only men, 5% women. So it's visible. So many journalists go to see the train, and many journalists go to the caravan because they are visible. And we are the same, the researchers. We go to to the people we find. It's hard to find people who are trying to hide.
Thank you, Dolores, for all of your really important work. I'm learning so much here today. But I'm going to ask a question that makes us step back a little bit about a topic I don't think we've discussed yet today, and that is the historical moment where Mexican migration seems to have ended. Or is it net zero, or has diminished in great numbers? So my question to you is, what is the political discourse in Mexico at this moment, where you do have a nation that is now called forth to serve as one big border enforcement? However, you have a population since the 1880s that has had all kinds of enganchadores, embracero programs. So you have generations of families who also had their people go on trains. What's the popular response?
I think that the documented Mexican migration has increased, in fact. And probably, Ruben, no? You know that better than me.
Last year, through the H-2 visa program, Mexicans received 260,000 visas to come to work temporarily in the U.S.
Yes, so, and that's also interesting because I have been stating in Mexico that they are doing the same with Central America. They are trying to do work programs to document people, and they are speaking about development programs in southern Mexico, not letting them more than the isthmus, but working in Mexico. But those programs are always almost 90% men, again. So we have more and more a feminized migration and no work for migrant women. Yes, so I think that there is a change, a very important change from the 80s, and you mentioned that we have much less undocumented migration, and that's zero, tasa cero, right? Net zero migration has to do with deportation, of course, and with return, with voluntary return, and with much less people coming to the United States without documents. But all the discourses against the Central American migration was much before that zero net migration Mexican. So I think that there is, at the 80s, in the 80s, we had also a very, very numerous, a huge Mexican undocumented migration to the United States. But the situation was the same. We tried to stop and we sell to the United States, we will stop. That was the 2001 Plan Sur, was that exactly. It was at that time Bush and Vicente Fox had a meeting, and it was a negotiation of almost several months, and finally they had a deal. The Mexican government called it La Enchilada Completa. It was a big migration deal for Mexican people, and in exchange, we would put the Plan Sur to stop the Central American migration. So Mexico has a long history of dealing with the Central American migration in exchange for its own migrants or in exchange for its own merchandises.
We have time for one last question, if anybody has it.
I'm going to ask this question in Spanish to be more clear. It's easier for me. Estuve trabajando migración de tránsito en Sinaloa y algo que me llamó la atención cuando hicimos este trabajo con las personas en Mazatlán específicamente fue que hablaban de las personas que apoyaban a los migrantes, personas de la comunidad, tenían un discurso que no los estigmatizaba, ciertas personas de ciertas comunidades por donde pasaban los migrantes, y me llamó la atención cómo estas personas que estaban en contacto con migrantes, personas que también son marginadas, que también son víctimas de violencias de distintos tipos, sentían esta empatía con los y las migrantes que transitaban. Y por otro lado me encontraba con que en una comunidad también ahí en Mazatlán, se llama la Isla de la Piedra, se asentó un grupo de migrantes hondureños y comenzaron a haber ya conflictos entre los nativos, las personas que son originarias de la Isla de la Piedra y los migrantes que estaban asentándose en esa comunidad. A nivel nacional, ¿cómo usted percibe la opinión pública hacia los y las migrantes en tránsito, que se asientan o que están en este estado de, digamos, no sabemos si se van a asentar o van a continuar su camino? ¿Cuál es la percepción general y cómo lo explica?
So yes, I think this is important. There are some communities that receive migrants and are very welcoming for migrants, and that is in the southern and also in the northern, ¿cómo te llamas? Fernando speaks about Mazatlán, so in the northwest of Mexico. In many parts of Mexico, you have big communities, big towns who receive migrants and have a tradition of helping them, giving them food, usually different when they settle. And that's what he's stressing. When we see that they settle, we begin to be some unrest. And that was the case with the Haitians. They were received with a lot of solidarity in Tijuana. But when we saw that they wouldn't go to the US, that they couldn't cross anymore, we were kind of worried. And we changed. Suddenly we were not so solidar with them. So yes, that's...
One more question. Rodolfo Casillas, please.
Bueno, en el receso le hice un comentario a Cecilia que me invitó a que lo compartiera con ustedes, y es en relación a cómo el delito es un proceso social, pero también es un proceso empresarial que ha encontrado en los migrantes un nicho de mercado específico, ¿no? Nosotros sabemos históricamente que los migrantes son objeto de agresiones de todo tipo, ¿no? Y hablamos de los traficantes y de todo lo que aquí también se ha comentado, pero quizás no le hemos dado la atención que merece, como el surgimiento, o mejor dicho, el crecimiento de los cárteles que originalmente eran de la droga exclusivamente, empezaron a crecer no por la acción del gobierno de México que los golpeara y que se pulverizaran, que esa fue la versión oficial del gobierno a partir de Calderón hacia el presente, ¿no? Lo que pasa es de que los propios cárteles, sobre todo con las contradicciones entre ellos, y por otro lado, en la búsqueda de nuevos mercados, fue así como los Zetas, gracias a que en alguna ocasión las redes de tráfico de cubanos, que ya no los traían directos a Miami, los traen a México, necesitan protección a sus migrantes para que lleguen sanos a la frontera, lleguen a Ciudad Juárez. Y era la época del pie seco y el pie mojado, ¿se acuerdan de esa época? ¿No? Entonces, los cubanos, para tener la posibilidad de solicitar asilo político en Estados Unidos, tenían que llegar con el pie seco. ¿Qué quiere decir? A través del continente y no por el mar, ¿no? Porque era pie mojado. Eso los obligó entonces a venir a México. Los Zetas, que ya se habían distinguido del cártel del Golfo, ¿no? Pero habían sido, digamos, el brazo armado del cártel del Golfo, conocían la ruta del Golfo desde Tabasco hasta Tamaulipas, y esa fue la ruta por la que trajeron a los cubanos, ¿no? Fue así como, digamos, un cártel que iba buscando su nuevo nicho de mercado, encontró con los migrantes, podía encontrar dinero. Muchos de los académicos durante mucho tiempo siempre habíamos señalado que los migrantes no tenían dinero, ¿no? Bueno, los cárteles nos mostraron que los migrantes sí tienen dinero, hipotecando más su futuro. Y es entonces cuando empiezan a practicar el secuestro express como un primer ejercicio, más o menos entre el 2004 al 2006, ¿no? Y ven que de esa manera impune les da un ingreso, y entonces evolucionan al secuestro masivo, ¿no? Hay una estadística de la Policía Federal de México que da datos como a partir del 2007 en adelante, la policía reporta que libera en promedio a 10,000 migrantes que están transitando por México y fueron secuestrados por el crimen organizado. Imagínense, si ya para el 2007 se liberan a 10,000, ¿qué quiere decir? ¿Qué estaba ocurriendo antes? ¿Y a cuántos no liberan? ¿Y cuántos de esos son materia de trabajo para los pozoleros, que son los que se encargan de disolver los cuerpos? Bueno, ahí tenemos cómo el crimen organizado evoluciona y encuentra ese nicho de mercado. Por eso, un primer informe de la CNDH habla de que en un periodo muy corto, en 6 meses, por la liberación de los secuestrados, se estaba pagando poco más de $20 millones en ese lapso. ¿Y por qué? ¿Por qué medio? Por Western Union, que es un medio muy socorrido en México y en Centroamérica para recibir las remesas que vienen de acá. Entonces, ese era un poco el comentario, un poco para contextualizar y ver cómo la importancia y el peso del crimen organizado que subordina a las redes de tráfico, son redes diferentes, ¿no? Pero se van articulando no solo los delitos, sino las formas de organización delictivas que afectan a los migrantes.
Thank you, Rodolfo. We're going to have to move. Amarela has one question. Super short,
Sí, no,
super
es una
comment.
pregunta,
Muy cortita, Amarela,
pues,
por favor.
Como la profesora, agradecerte, Dolores, no solo tu trabajo, sino tu templanza, ¿no? Yo creo que nos inspiras nos transmites una paz que no sé de dónde sacas después de saber tanto. Y por eso te voy a hacer la pregunta, en este diagnóstico que haces, ¿tú cuáles crees que serían mecanismos, ya no para terminar con las cuotas de dolor social que narras, sino para detener, digamos, para que no se, porque lo que narras es que no solo no se detiene, sino va creciendo y se va complejizando, ¿no? O sea, ¿qué pistas? Y una pregunta que te he hecho varias veces, no te estoy preguntando de pistas para la política pública. ¿Cuál es nuestro rol? ¿Qué podemos aportar para frenar esta guerra total? Como investigadoras.
Nuestro rol como investigadores y como estudiantes es estudiar, publicar y hacer visible lo que es invisible, ¿no? Eso es nuestro rol. Y eso puede tener consecuencias a veces, pero que casi nunca vamos a ver, ¿no? Uno a veces quiere saber enseguida que es el trabajo más que más me ha gustado personalmente fue trabajar como expert witness en algunos juicios en Estados Unidos, porque sabía, I could see the results, and we usually never see the results. We think that we just speak in for the air. And otro papel totalmente distinto es como activistas. Ahí tenemos la obligación de estar denunciando, ¿no? Y aunque no sea el momento políticamente correcto, seguir denunciando que lo que se sigue haciendo, ¿no? Y acompañando, como tú lo has hecho, pues a los migrantes en sus luchas.